The panel screamed at me first. Not a gradual warning, not a polite chime. A full, red spectrum alarm that lit up every surface in the maintenance corridor like the ship had decided to become a sunset. I pulled my arm back from the junction socket, and the diagnostic reader in my other hand went dark. Then the panel sealed itself. Then the one behind me. Then the emergency strip along the floor drew a glowing rectangle around my boots, and a voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Unregistered conductive element detected in Crew Zone 4. Quarantine protocol active. Please do not move. I looked at the reader, dead. I looked at the panel, sealed. I looked at the floor around my feet, at the red rectangle that was now, technically, my entire world. Then I looked at my left wrist. The bracelet sat there the way it always sat there. Thin copper, 3 small charms on a worn link chain. A fish, no bigger than my thumbnail. A small cross, the kind you'd find in a grandmother's jewelry box anywhere on Earth. And 2 tiny hands clasped together, the fingers worn smooth from decades of someone else's thumb running over them before they ever reached mine. Tarnished past caring. Non-regulation in every measurable way. I had filed 7 exemption requests with the Consortium Compliance Office over the past 2 years. All 7 had come back denied with the same 2-word notation: insufficient justification. I was wearing it anyway. Right, okay, great. The ship was CSS Meridian, a Tier 3 joint operations vessel running under Galactic Consortium Registry. 6 crew, 1 human. The math on that had never bothered me the way people back on Earth seemed to think it should. I had grown up in a shipyard town where the ratio of people who understood what you were doing to people who didn't was always about 1 to several. You got used to being the one. My name is De La Vasquez. I am 31 years old. I hold a Class B engineering certification from the Consortium Technical Institute, which took me 4 years longer to earn than it would have taken a V-Thrani candidate, because the curriculum was designed around sensory ranges I do not have. I modified my diagnostic reader 14 months ago because the standard grip diameter was calibrated for V-Thrani handspans, and I kept dropping it during high-pressure procedures, and I got tired of dropping things. The modification was not authorized. I filed a request. It was denied. I did it anyway. That is, as I would later tell the compliance officer who beamed in via holographic panel, a pattern I have. Sewell came around the corner at a pace that I had learned, over 14 months of working alongside them, meant they were trying to appear unhurried while actually being extremely concerned. The V-Thrani moved the way old rivers moved, all smooth surface and significant current underneath. They stopped at the edge of my quarantine perimeter and looked at me through the sealed panel, housing with the particular expression their face made when I had done something they found baffling and inconvenient. I waved. Sewell did not wave back. Sewell did not have the anatomy for waving, but the 3 slow clicks they produced, low and resonant, communicated something that the ship's translation system rendered as, "Vasquez, explain." "Device malfunction," I said, "except it isn't the device." 2 clicks, the translator gave me the bracelet. "The bracelet," I confirmed. 1 long, sustained note. Not quite a click, more like a held breath if V-Thrani breathed the way humans did. The translator did not render it. There were sounds Sewell made that the system simply returned as untranslatable, and over 14 months I had developed my own working dictionary for them. That particular sound meant something close to. I knew this was going to happen eventually, and I am not pleased to have been right. "The ship's VI has flagged it as an unregistered conductive element," I said, "which is technically accurate. Copper alloy, old, not consortium certified." "How old?" I looked at the bracelet, at the clasped hand's charm, the seam of the tiny fingers dark with tarnish that no amount of polishing ever fully reached. "Older than me," I said, "by about 40 years. Sewell looked at the bracelet, then back at me, then at the 4 sealed panels in the corridor. Then at the secondary alert that had now appeared on the wall display, indicating that the quarantine had expanded to include the adjacent service alcove, because the ship's VI was interpreting my elevated heart rate as threat escalation. My heart rate was elevated because I was trying very hard not to laugh. This was making it worse. "The coolant junction," Sewell said. "I know. Junction 7 connects to the—" "I know, Sewell. If the cascade lock reaches the secondary routing." "I am aware of the junction layout," I said. "I installed half of it. Can you get me a bypass cable from the port locker, the blue one, the one with the modified grip?" Another untranslatable sound, but they went to get the cable. I stood in my glowing red rectangle and looked at the bracelet and thought about Lolacita, which I was not going to do, which I was absolutely doing anyway, because that was also a pattern I had. She had given it to me the night before my first consortium posting, pressed it into my palm in the kitchen of the house I grew up in Batangas, where the air smelled like salt water and diesel, and the kind of cooking that takes all day. She had not said much. Lolacita had never been a woman who said much when her hands could say it instead. She pressed the bracelet into my palm and closed my fingers around it and said, in the particular Tagalog she used when something mattered, "For your travels." As if that explained it. As if a tarnished copper bracelet with 3 old charms was navigation equipment. She died 9 months later. I was on my second posting by then, 6 light months out, and the message arrived 17 days after the fact, and I sat in a maintenance corridor not entirely unlike this one, and held the bracelet in both hands and stayed there until Sewell, who was my shift partner even then, came and found me and said nothing at all, which was exactly right. I had filed my first exemption request 3 days after that. Insufficient justification, the response said. I kept wearing it. The ship's VI spoke again. Calm, as always, genderless, calibrated to a frequency range that registered as soothing to 6 different species, and that I personally found mildly aggravating in the way that very patient people can be mildly aggravating when you know you're the one causing the problem. Crew member Vasquez, quarantine protocol remains active. Please remain within the designated perimeter. I am within the designated perimeter, I said. Your heart rate indicates elevated stress. My heart rate indicates I find this situation mildly funny, which is a human thing and not a threat indicator. A pause. The VI processed this. The distinction between elevated stress and elevated amusement produces similar biometric readings in human physiology. The system cannot differentiate. I know, I said, that's a design gap. It is noted, said the VI, in the tone of something that would not be nodding it anywhere. Sewell returned with the cable. Blue, modified grip, worn smooth at the handle from my hand and my hand only, because I was the only crew member with hands shaped like mine. They passed it through the panel gap carefully, like passing something through the bars of a cage, which I appreciated them not saying out loud. The compliance officer is being contacted, Sewell said. Of course they are. Captain Urthaz has been notified. Of course. There is currently no exemption form in the consortium filing system that covers a human sentimental object triggering a cascade quarantine lock. I took the cable. I looked at the junction panel. I looked at my red rectangle. The perimeter was wide enough that I could reach the panel edge if I stretched, which was going to be uncomfortable, and one-handed, which was going to be more uncomfortable, because the bracelet wrist had to stay inside the perimeter, or the VI would interpret the movement as an attempt to breach quarantine. There wouldn't be, I said. This has never happened before. Has it not? I thought about it. 17 years since humanity joined the consortium. Thousands of human crew members across hundreds of consortium vessels. 7 billion humans who were, statistically, the most object-attached species the consortium had ever cataloged. The species that kept dead people's watches, that saved childhood blankets until the fabric gave out, that carried photographs of faces into the dark between stars. Maybe it has, I said. Maybe whoever it happened to before was smarter about it and took the thing off. 3 soft clicks, low. Almost gentle. The translator did not render them, but I knew that one. 14 months had given me that one. It meant you would not have taken it off. No, I said, reaching for the panel with one hand while the other wrist stayed inside its glowing rectangle, the bracelet catching the amber light of the corridor, the little copper fish, the cross, the clasped hands. I would not have. The junction panel was tight. The bypass socket was not designed for human finger width, but my fingers were smaller than V-Thrani standard, which was the one-dimensional advantage I had ever had in this job, and I threaded the cable through slowly, carefully, talking to the panel the way I always talked to difficult equipment, which was personally and with specific grievances. You and I told the junction panel, are going to resolve this quickly, because I have a compliance officer incoming and a captain who is going to look at me with that expression, and I would like to have at least one problem solved before both of those things happen. The panel did not respond. Equipment never did. But it also never stopped me from trying. Sewell watched from the other side of the sealed housing. They did not click. They did not speak. They watched the way they always watched me work, with the quality of attention that I had come to recognize as the V-Thrani version of something humans might call, if they were being generous, respect, and might call, if they were being accurate, baffled tolerance of consistently unauthorized methodology that nonetheless kept producing results. The cable seated. The preliminary connector light blinked from red to amber. Amber meant not fixed yet, but also not actively getting worse. I would take amber. Above me, the ship hummed. Around me, the red perimeter glowed. On my wrist, the bracelet sat, old and worn and copper-warm, and the holographic panel at the end of the corridor flickered to life as the compliance officer connected, and Captain Arthaz appeared behind them, resonance low and careful, and I was still inside my glowing rectangle with one hand in a junction socket and the other wrist held steady at my side. For your travels, Lola Sita had said. Right, okay. I kept working. The compliance officer had the particular quality of calm that takes 400 years of institutional practice to produce. The Ori as a species did not rush. They did not visibly react. They communicated in a register that the consortium had selected as its administrative standard precisely, because it registered as neutral to the largest number of species simultaneously, and the one beaming into my corridor via holographic panel had the additional quality, specific to senior compliance officers, of making you feel that whatever you had done was not surprising to them, and that your subsequent explanation was largely a formality. She introduced herself as Compliance Officer Vale. She looked at the sealed panels. She looked at the quarantine perimeter around my boots. She looked at me, still one-handed inside the junction socket, cable threaded but not yet connected. She looked at the bracelet. Crew member Vasquez, she said, please describe the object. Copper alloy bracelet, 3 attached charms, fish cross-joined hands, non-consortium certified material, 112 years old approximately. It was my grandmother's. That is a relational descriptor, Vale said, not a purpose descriptor. Please clarify functional use. I opened my mouth, I closed it. My grandmother had pressed it into my hand in a kitchen that smelled like all-day cooking and said for your travels. I had worn it through 2 consortium postings and one of the worst nights of my life, and 7 denied exemption requests, and 14 months aboard a ship where I was the only human and the only one who fixed things by talking to them. It was on my wrist right now because I had chosen, every single morning for 9 years, to put it there instead of leaving it in the small box in my crew quarters where the safe and authorized things lived. It's personal, I said, sentimental. Sentiment, Vale said carefully. This is a recognized human designator for non-rational value assignment. That's one way to put it. Captain Arthaz stood behind the compliance window, silent. The Vithrani captain was old in the way that things which have been in motion for a very long time become old, with a quality of weight to them that isn't heaviness. Their resonance was low and even and reading, to my 2 years of approximate translation, as careful attention. They were filing this away somewhere. The object triggered the quarantine cascade, Vale said, not as an accusation, as a statement of record. It registered as an unregistered conductive element in a Tier 2 maintenance zone during an active systems audit. Yes. You were aware it was non-certified. Yes. You filed 7 exemption requests over a period of 26 months. Yes. All 7 were denied. Yes. And you continued to wear the object. I looked at the bracelet. The fish charm was almost too small to see properly in the corridor's amber light, but I knew every detail of it from touch. The scale texture along its side, the fin that curved slightly left, the tail that had been worn smoother than the body from years of being the charm my thumb always found first. Yes, I said. Vale looked at the bracelet for 3 seconds. For an Ori, 3 seconds of uninterrupted visual attention was the equivalent of a long conversation. The ship's VI has indicated your cardiac readings remain elevated. Are you experiencing distress? I'm experiencing a situation, I said. There's a difference. Please clarify. Distress is when the thing happening to you feels bad. A situation is when the thing happening to you is also kind of your own fault, and you're trying to stay useful anyway. Vale processed this. Her 3 eyelids blinked in sequence, which I had learned from 17 years of humanity's accumulated contact notes, meant she was cross-referencing against something. The junction, Sewell said from the side quietly. Right, the junction. I turned back to the panel and pushed the cable connector another centimeter into its socket. The amber light held. The pressure differential on the secondary display had not moved in 4 minutes, which meant I had bought time but not fixed anything yet. Vasquez, Arthaz spoke for the first time. Their voice came through the ship's translation system with a quality that the system always slightly failed to capture, a resonance beneath the words, like a note played on an instrument you're feeling more than hearing. How long for the junction? 20 minutes if the bypass seat's clean, 35 if it doesn't. And if the cascade reaches the secondary routing before that. Then we have a larger conversation, and I apologize in advance. Arthaz's resonance shifted, not displeasure, something that in a human face might have moved the corners of a mouth slightly. 20 minutes, they said. Vale, please continue your inquiry within that window. Vale accepted this without comment. The Ori were not, in my experience, unreasonable. They operated from a framework of categories, and when the categories were insufficient, they built new ones. This was, actually, more than could be said for plenty of human institutions I had dealt with. The problem was the building took time, and the building required information, and the information required conversation, and I was one-handed in a junction socket inside a glowing rectangle, so the conversation was going to be what it was going to be. The object, Vale said again, you described it as belonging to a deceased biological relative. My grandmother, she died 9 years ago. And prior to her death, did the object perform a function? I thought about Lola Sita wearing it every day of her life that I could remember. At the market, at mass, in the kitchen, on the bad days and the ordinary days and the few very good days that I could still see clearly when I tried. I thought about the particular way she touched the clasped hand's charm when something worried her, not frantically, just the way you touch something solid when the ground under you isn't. Yes, I said, it did. What function? The cable moved another half centimeter. The junction socket resisted, the way old systems always resisted, not because they were broken, but because they had settled into a particular shape over years of use and weren't interested in accommodating something new without argument. It reminded her, I said, that she wasn't carrying things alone. Vale was quiet for 4 seconds. This function is not cataloged in consortium purpose classifications for physical objects. I know. It is not a communication device. It does not store data. It does not perform a measurable action on the physical world. No. And yet you identify it as functional. Yes. Another 4-second pause. Humans assign persistent functional value to objects that no longer perform physical actions. This is noted in early contact documentation, but has not been formalized in compliance categories. We have treated it as non-rational value assignment. You are suggesting it is not non-rational. I stopped working for a moment. I turned and looked at the holographic panel, at Vale's pale, still face, at the 3 eyelids and the precise stillness that was not coldness. I had come to understand, but the aura equivalent of very serious attention. It's not non-rational, I said. It's a different kind of rational. It's the kind that doesn't have numbers. Sewell clicked, low, short, untranslatable, but the quality of it was something I would have called in a human listening. Arthaz said nothing, but I felt the shift in their resonance from 3 meters away, the way you feel a change in air pressure before the weather actually changes. Vasquez, Vale said, may I ask a question that is outside standard compliance inquiry parameters? That was not a sentence I had ever heard from a consortium official. I pulled my arm back slightly and looked at her properly. Yes. The figure with joined hands. You have described it as a charm. In human cultural traditions documented in consortium archives, joined hands as a symbol appears in contexts of both prayer and grief. Which context applies here? I looked at the charm, the tiny clasped fingers worn smooth at the tips. Both, I said. When my grandmother was alive, it was prayer. After she wasn't, it became, I paused. I turned the word over. Both, at the same time. This is possible for humans, to hold 2 emotional contexts in a single object simultaneously. We do it all the time, I said. It's one of the things we're built for. Vale processed this for 5 full seconds. We do not have a compliance category for an object that performs 2 functions depending on the observer's internal state. I know. We will need to create one. I turned back to the junction. The cable was 3/4 seated, 10 more minutes if the socket cooperated. You're going to create a new compliance category because of a copper bracelet. Because of what the bracelet represents in terms of an unclassified functional mechanism, Vale said. The bracelet is the instance. The mechanism is the category. I thought about that. I thought about 7 denied exemption requests. Insufficient justification. I thought about the particular feeling of putting the bracelet on every morning for 9 years. The copper warm in the way that things worn daily become warm, absorbing the heat of you until they feel like a part of you. What will you call it? I asked. A pause. We are still determining. The current working designation is relational object of sustained grief function. It is imprecise. We will refine it. It works, I said, functionally speaking. The junction socket accepted the cable. The amber light blinked once, twice, and shifted to green. I exhaled. My back ached from the angle. My left wrist was stiff from holding it inside the perimeter for 30 minutes. The secondary coolant display ticked downward, the pressure differential correcting itself in small, steady increments, the way problems resolve when you give them the right connection. The perimeter was still lit around my feet. The bracelet was still on my wrist. I was still technically in quarantine. But Junction 7 was no longer trying to become everyone's problem, and that was the most useful thing I had done in the last half hour, and I was going to take it. Vasquez Orthaz said, "Captain, well done." It was 2 words. Orthaz did not use many more than necessary, but the resonance underneath them was not just approval. It was something older and heavier than approval. It was the sound of something being taken seriously. I looked at the bracelet, the fish, the cross, the clasped hands. Lola Sita had never filed an exemption request in her life. She had never asked anyone to categorize what she carried or explain it in terms that fit a form. She had pressed a copper bracelet into my hand and said, "For your travels," and expected me to understand, which I had, eventually, which was how understanding usually worked. I thought the consortium was, slowly, starting to understand too. Not that I was going to say that out loud. 22 minutes, I said instead. I was hopping for 20, but the socket was stubborn. Noted, said Orthaz, and the resonance beneath it just barely was warmth. I have a rule about problems on consortium vessels. The rule is simple. If the problem is in the panel, fix the panel. If the problem is in the routing, fix the routing. If the problem is in the category system of a 400-year-old galactic governing body, and there is no form in existence anywhere in consortium legal records to cover what is happening to you right now, then fix the junction first and deal with the category system while standing in a glowing quarantine rectangle, one-handed, talking to whatever official appears on your holographic panel. I was now on step 3. Vale had not disconnected. She was, in the efficient way of ORI compliance officers, already building the new exemption framework in real time, cross-referencing it against 43 cultural lineage reports from the first decade of human consortium contact. I could see her working behind the stillness of her expression, the way you can see water moving under ice if you look long enough. Captain Orthaz had pulled up a secondary chair, which meant they intended to stay, which meant they considered this worth staying for, which I had 2 years of experience reading correctly. Sewell was reorganizing the port locker with the specific intensity of a Vithrani, who has decided that having something to do with their hands is preferable to standing around clicking. The coolant pressure had stabilized at 94.2% of normal, which was not perfect but was operating range, and the secondary display had stopped its alarming tick and settled into the patient hum of a system running a little harder than ideal but not harder than it could manage. The problem, I said to no one in particular, because talking out loud while I worked was a habit I had given up trying to break, is not the bracelet. It is the system's response to the bracelet, Vale said, which was not the response I expected, because she was still working and I had not expected her to be listening. Yes, I said. The bracelet has existed for 112 years without causing a cascade quarantine lock. The system has existed for 400 years without encountering a situation it couldn't categorize. Something was going to give eventually. You believe the fault is with the system. I believe the fault is with the gap between the system and the reality it's supposed to be managing, which is not anyone's fault specifically. It's just what happens when the reality gets bigger than the categories. Sewell made a sound, short, two-toned. The translator gave it as, Vasquez does this regularly. Does what regularly? Vale asked. Makes things bigger than the categories, Sewell said, and then insists the categories are the problem. I turned to look at Sewell. They were still reorganizing the locker, back turned, entirely too focused on the arrangement of bypass cables to be as unaware of the conversation as they were pretending to be. I appreciate that, I said. It was not a compliment. I know, I appreciated it anyway. 3 clicks, the kind that didn't get translated. I had that one filed under. Sewell is exasperated in a way that is slightly warmer than pure exasperation. Vale looked between us. The Ori were observers by training and inclination, and she was observing this exchange with the quality of someone adding data to a working model. "You have a functional working relationship," she said. "We work," I said. "Whether it's functional is a matter of perspective." "It functions," Sewell said. "The methodology is irregular. The results are within acceptable range." "Within acceptable range," I repeated. "You could put that on my crew file." "It is already on your crew file," Urthaz said. I looked at the captain. Their expression was unreadable in the way Vithrani expressions were always technically unreadable if you were going by face alone. But the resonance was doing something quiet and precise that, in 2 years, I had never heard from them in response to a crew member's personnel record. It was doing the thing that meant, and this is not a criticism. I went back to the junction panel. The bypass cable was holding, the pressure was stable, the crisis, such as it had been, was contained. What remained was the quarantine perimeter still lit around my feet, and the compliance framework being built in real time, and the bracelet on my wrist that had started all of this. The copper fish and the cross and the clasped hands, warm in the amber light of a corridor on a ship 6 light months from anywhere I had grown up knowing. "Vasquez," Vale said. "Yes. I have been reviewing the contact documentation from the first decade of human consortium interaction. There are 43 reports noting the human practice of retaining physical objects belonging to deceased biological relatives. The practice is described across every cultural lineage surveyed. There is variation in the type of object, but the mechanism appears consistent." "What mechanism?" "The object functions as a point of continued relational contact. The human who carries it is not cognitively treating the deceased as absent. The object maintains a form of presence. It is," a pause, "not symbolic. It is functional. The function is the presence itself." I stopped working. I did not turn around. The corridor was quiet except for the hum of the ship, and the soft tick of the coolant system returning to normal, and the sound of Sewell moving cables in the port locker. I had lived inside this understanding for 9 years without ever having it said back to me in those words, clean and clear and completely accurate. "Yes," I said, "that's right. We classified it as non-rational because we do not have this mechanism. For species without it, the object is inert after the death of its original owner. There is nothing to maintain, but for humans the relationship continues, and the object is the method." "The consortium doesn't do that," I said, not a question. "We do not. When a member of our species ends, the relationship ends. We do not have the mechanism to continue it." A pause. "I do not say this as a judgment, I say it as a data gap. We have been categorizing a human function we do not share as irrational when the more accurate designation is unmapped." I turned and looked at her then. Vale was still and careful and absolutely serious, and there was something in the precision of her attention that I had not expected from a compliance inquiry, and that I did not have a fast word for. "Unmapped," I said. "We intend to correct that," she said. Behind me, Sewell had stopped moving the cables. Urthaz's resonance had gone very still, the way still water goes still, with depth underneath it. I looked at the bracelet, the fish, the cross, the clasped hands. Lola Sita had 7 grandchildren. She had given each of us something to carry. My cousin B got the rosary with the blue beads. My cousin Marco got the pocket watch that had belonged to our grandfather, who had died before any of us were born. My cousin Inez got the small embroidered cloth that had hung above the kitchen door for as long as any of us could remember, with the stitched words in Tagalog that translated, roughly, as, "Whatever comes, we manage." I got the bracelet. I had never asked why. I had always known, the way you know things that were decided about you before you could form the question. She knew I was going furthest. Vasquez, Sewell said. I looked over. They had turned from the locker. They were looking at the bracelet with the particular stillness that meant they were thinking something they had not decided whether to say yet. What? I asked. My people, Sewell said, do not retain objects from the dead. When someone returns to the resonance field, the relationship, a click, searching, closes. There is nothing to carry forward. We did not know when I first worked with you that you were carrying someone forward. I observed the bracelet. I noted the exemption denials. I did not ask. You didn't need to ask, I said. I did not think it was my place. It wasn't, but you also didn't push for me to take it off when you found out it was the source of all this. Sewell was quiet for a moment. 3 soft clicks, the kind I had filed under. This is harder to say than I am making it appear. It was not my place to push, they said. But also, another pause, you had reasons, even if I could not categorize them. You had reasons, and in 14 months I have observed that when Vasquez has reasons, the reasons are usually. The translator offered, not without merit. I laughed. Actual, real laughter in the empty corridor, in the glowing red rectangle, with the compliance officer building new frameworks and the captain watching and the junction holding steady at green. It sounded strange in that space. Not wrong, just bigger than the corridor expected. Sewell made the sound I had filed under warmth. Vale watched this exchange with the focus of someone adding a significant note to a working document. Human emotional response, she said, moves between states rapidly and without apparent external cause. It has internal causes, I said. They're just not always visible. Yes, we are learning that. She looked at her records. The new exemption category will be filed under the designation, Relational Object of Sustained Connection. We have refined the wording from the earlier draft. The category will cover any non-certified physical object that serves a verified function in the ongoing maintenance of a human's relational bond with a deceased individual. The verification requirement will be the crew member's written statement. No further documentation required. I looked at her. You're taking my word for it. You are the expert on your own interior function, Vale said. It would not be rational for us to require external verification of an internal state. 14 months of working in a category gap that 400 years of consortium administration had not gotten around to mapping, and the solution when it came was, you know best what you're carrying. Tell us, and we'll make room for it. I had not expected it to be that simple. Not simple in the sense of easy, simple in the sense of clean. Okay, I said. Okay, then for the record, I wear the bracelet because my grandmother gave it to me the night before I shipped out for the first time. She died 9 months later. I have worn it every day since. It reminds me that I am not the first person in my family to go somewhere difficult and come back. It reminds me that she believed I would come back. It reminds me she is still, I stopped. One breath. Still paying attention. The corridor held the sentence for a moment. Vale entered something into her record. Verified, she said simply. The exemption is approved, effective immediately. Category 7441H. The first of its kind. The quarantine perimeter will clear once the VI registers the exemption in the crew manifest, she added. Approximately 90 seconds. I looked at the glowing red rectangle around my boots. 90 seconds. I had stood in this rectangle for 47 minutes. I had fixed a coolant junction from inside it, one-handed, with a modified cable and a panel that didn't want to cooperate. I had explained the function of a copper bracelet to a 400-year-old administrative framework and watched the framework decide, efficiently and without fanfare, to expand. The fish charm caught the amber light. The clasped hands were warm from my wrist heat, the way they were always warm. Lolacita, I said quietly, because the corridor was quiet enough that quiet things were allowed. You caused an absolute amount of trouble today. The ship hummed. The VI chimed once, soft, and the red perimeter around my feet dimmed, faded, and went out. I stepped forward. Nothing stopped me. There is a particular quality to the hours after a crisis on a ship. The air does not change. The light does not change. The systems tick and hum and maintain exactly as they did before, because a ship's systems do not have the architecture for relief. But the people on the ship have it, and it moves through a closed environment the way temperature moves, slow and thorough, until the whole space has a different feel. I noticed it first in the way Sewell moved. The V-Thrani had a default walking pace that I had calibrated over 14 months as their baseline. Purposeful, efficient, the pace of a species that considered unnecessary motion a minor philosophical error. After the quarantine cleared and the compliance window closed and Earthaz returned to the bridge, Sewell's pace changed by a margin that a sensor would not have registered as significant. But I was not a sensor. They were moving the way a very controlled thing moves when the pressure has come down, and the control can ease slightly without anyone losing face. Not relief, exactly. Something older and quieter than relief. The V-Thrani did not have a word for it in any dialect their translation system exported. But I had filed it under. The feeling after the thing you were worried about did not end badly. I was cleaning the junction housing when Sewell came to stand beside me. They did not speak for a moment. They looked at the green light on the panel, at the corrected pressure reading, at the bypass cable seated cleanly in its socket. "Vasquez calibrated," they said. I looked at them. "The cable modification," Sewell said. "The grip diameter. I have used the standard phrasing in my incident notes to describe the equipment as crew member modified. I will update the terminology." "You don't need to do that." "The modification produced a functional result under non-standard operating conditions," Sewell said. "It should be correctly attributed." I looked at the cable, the worn handle, the grip that fit my hand because I had made it fit my hand, after the third time in a month that the standard version had slipped during a critical procedure, and I had decided that the regulation was wrong and that I was going to be the one to correct it and deal with the paperwork afterward. "Vasquez calibrated," I said. "Okay." "It is a term," Sewell said, "that will appear in the incident report, which will be filed in the consortium record, which is," a pause, the searching kind, "a form of continued presence, in the record." I stopped cleaning the housing. I turned and looked at Sewell, who was looking at the panel, very focused, with the quality of a V-Thrani who has said something they calculated carefully before saying it, and who will not be making eye contact while the statement settles. "You've been thinking about what Vale said," I said, "about the mechanism, objects as continued presence." "I have been thinking about the concept since you sat in the perimeter for 47 minutes without removing the bracelet," Sewell said. "I considered that there was a reason. I did not understand the reason at the time. I understand it better now." "But your people don't do it." "No, when someone returns to the resonance field, there is nothing to carry forward. The self is not locatable in an object." A pause. "But I have observed across 14 months that you carry your grandmother in the bracelet in a way that appears to function. She is, in some measurable way, present in your behavior, in your choices, in the way you talk to equipment when it refuses to cooperate." I laughed, small and real. "She talked to everything." "Yes," Sewell said. "I know. You told me 11 months ago during the secondary engine housing repair. You said, 'My grandmother believed that things worked better when they knew someone was paying attention.'" I had said that. I had forgotten saying it. Sewell had not. "I did not understand it at the time," Sewell continued. "I do not fully understand it now, but I observe that the junction is repaired, and I observe that you spoke to it throughout the process, and I observe that the correlation, while not provable, is consistent. That's either the most or least scientific thing you've ever said to me." "Both," Sewell said, "simultaneously." I looked at them. Then I looked at the bracelet. Then I started laughing again, the real kind, the kind that comes from somewhere below your chest and doesn't have a specific target, just the general direction of the universe and how strange it is. Sewell made the untranslatable sound, the one I had filed under warmth. We stood in the clean corridor for a while, not talking, which was its own kind of conversation, and the ship hummed around us and the coolant ran at 97.3% now and climbing. And somewhere in the consortium legal system, a new exemption category was being entered into the record for the first time in 400 years. Arthaz called a full crew debrief 2 hours later. Standard post-incident procedure. 6 crew members around the central table in the briefing module, a room that smelled faintly of the recycled air that all consortium ships ran on, which I had come to think of as the specific smell of very far from home. The others had been monitoring from their stations during the incident. The Dravathi sensor specialist, Wa, whose coloring shifted slightly in a way I had learned to read as concerned when the coolant alarm had triggered. The 2 Meridian engineers, Kas and Stel, who were a species I had not worked with before this posting, and whose communication I was still learning, and who had spent the quarantine period running silent diagnostics on every system adjacent to Zone 4, which was the most useful thing they could have done, and which they had done without being asked. The 6th was the ship's medic, a Vithrani named Irath, who was younger than Sewell and who had come to my crew quarters during the quarantine to ask, through the door, if I needed anything, which was the consortium medic protocol and which I had found in the moment genuinely kind. I had said, "No, I'm okay, thank you." They had said, "The cardiac readings are elevated, not dangerously, but elevated." "I know," I had said. "It's a human thing. I find this kind of situation," I paused, funny in a way that looks like stress from the outside. A long pause from the other side of the door. Then, that is a very difficult thing to calibrate for. "Welcome to human physiology," I had said. "It's a challenge." Now Irath sat across the table from me and looked at the bracelet with the focused attention of someone who had been thinking about it since that conversation and had reached no conclusions they were confident in. The debrief was standard until Arthaz reached the section of the incident report covering the new compliance category. Category 7441H, Arthaz said. Relational object of sustained connection. First human origin legal precedent in consortium record. Filed under the general designation of human relational technology, subcategory, unmapped. They looked around the table. This is the record of what occurred on this ship today. I want each member of this crew to understand the precise nature of what occurred. This is not a malfunction correction. This is a category creation. The consortium's administrative framework does not create new categories often. It has done so today because the existing categories were insufficient to describe what crew member Vasquez carries. The table was quiet. What crew member Vasquez carries, Arthaz continued, is a mechanism the consortium has not cataloged. The mechanism is this: humans maintain active relationships with those who are no longer living. The relationship is real, it is functional, it operates through physical objects that serve as points of continued contact. It affects behavior, decision-making, and resilience in measurable ways. A pause. We have been calling this non-rational. It is not non-rational. We simply do not share it, and therefore we have not had the correct words for it. Wa's coloring shifted. The pattern it shifted to was not one I had seen before. Kas and Stel communicated in the fast, low-frequency exchange that was their species' equivalent of a private aside, which the translation system rendered as, "This is significant," and "Yes." Irath was looking at the bracelet. I was looking at the table. "Vasquez," Arthaz said. "Captain, is there anything you want to say for the record?" I thought about it. I thought about Lola Sita in the kitchen, about for your travels, About 9 years and 7 denied exemption requests, and 47 minutes in a glowing rectangle because I had decided, every day for 9 years, that some things were worth the trouble. She would have liked this, I said. The category, the record, being officially unmapped and then officially mapped. I looked at the bracelet. She liked things being made right, even when the making right took a long time and a significant amount of paperwork. Something moved across the table. Not quite laughter, not quite something else. The consortium species around me processed this in their different ways, and what I got back in the quality of the silence was the particular sound of people taking something seriously in real time. Noted, Arthaz said. The debrief closed. The crew dispersed. I stayed at the table for a moment, long enough to run my thumb over the fish charm, the cross, the clasped hands. Long enough to feel the copper, warm from my wrist, the weight of it so familiar that on the rare mornings I forgot to put it on, my left hand felt wrong all day until I corrected the error. Sewell passed the doorway, paused, clicked once. The translator gave it as adequate resolution. From Sewell, that was the same as excellent work. I stood up. I went back to the maintenance corridor. I had 3 more junction checks on the afternoon schedule, and the Meridian ran a tight schedule, and I was still an engineer on this ship with work that needed doing, bracelet and all, category 7441H and all. I talked to the first junction for a minute before I opened the panel. Just in case. On the 40th day after the quarantine incident, the Consortium Legal Archive published the full record of category 7441H in the General Access Database. I know the exact day because Vale contacted me directly to notify me, which was outside standard protocol, and which she noted as such in the same message, with the explanation that she had considered it appropriate given that I was the originating instance. The originating instance. I had been called many things in my engineering career. That one was new. The filing was 4 pages in the consortium's legal standard format, which was precise and dense, and not designed for casual reading. But the summary paragraph at the top, which Vale had written in the simplified register that the consortium used for cross-species accessibility, was something I read 3 times before I put the tablet down. It read, in part, the human practice of maintaining relational connection with deceased individuals through physical objects is hereby recognized as a functional mechanism with demonstrable behavioral effects. This mechanism does not correspond to any existing consortium species practice, and has therefore been categorized as a human-specific relational technology. Objects qualifying under this category perform a function that cannot be replicated by data storage, memorial records, or any currently cataloged form of preservation. The function is the maintenance of active presence. The mechanism is the choice, renewed daily, to carry the object forward. The choice, renewed daily, to carry the object forward. I read that sentence 4 times. Then I went to find Sewell. They were in the maintenance bay, running a standard diagnostic on the primary coupling assembly, which was Sewell's method of occupying themselves when they were between tasks and did not want to appear unoccupied, which I had identified by month 2 and never commented on because Sewell had also, by month 2, identified my habit of talking to uncooperative equipment and never commented on it, and we had arrived at a quiet agreement to allow each other our methods. I held out the tablet. Sewell read the summary paragraph, read it again, set the tablet down on the coupling assembly and looked at it for a moment. The choice renewed daily, they said. Yes. You make this choice every morning. Before I'm fully awake mostly, it's become automatic, but yes. Sewell was quiet for a moment. 3 clicks, spaced, which I had no translation for but which felt like thinking made audible. When I reported to this vessel 14 months ago, they said, I observed the bracelet on your first day. I noted it as a non-regulation item. I did not report it. I had not known that. Why not? Because you wore it as though it were regulation, Sewell said. As though the question of whether it was authorized had been resolved in a court I had not been present for, and the verdict had been, yes. I did not think I was qualified to reopen the case. I looked at them for a long moment, at the Vithrani stillness, the deep current under the smooth surface, at 14 months of working partnership built on the quiet agreement that some things did not need to be explained if the person explaining them carried them as though they were true. Sewell, I said. Vasquez. Thank you for not reporting it. It was outside my jurisdiction, they said. Which was Sewell for, you're welcome. I took the tablet back. I went to my crew quarters and put the tablet on the small shelf above my bunk, next to the box where I kept the things I was allowed to keep, and I sat on the edge of the bunk and looked at the bracelet in the light of a ship 6 light months from anywhere I had grown up, and I thought about Lola Sita, which was something I did often and which had become, over 9 years, less like an ache and more like a conversation. She would have found the whole thing funny. The consortium compliance framework, Vale with her 3 eyelids blinking in sequence, the quarantine perimeter around my boots, the 47 minutes in the glowing rectangle, the 4-page legal filing. The category that had not existed before this bracelet triggered a cascade lock on a routine audit day. She would have laughed the way she laughed, which was full and unhurried, the laugh of someone who had learned that things working out did not always look like working out while they were happening. For your travels, she had said. 9 years, 17 postings, 1 compliance category and counting. I was still traveling. I was still coming back. I touched the clasped hands, the worn tips of the tiny fingers, and I said, "You caused an absolute amount of trouble, Lola." The ship hummed around me. I turned the lights down. Outside the small porthole beside my bunk, the space between stars ran on in every direction, old and enormous and full of things that had not been mapped yet, things that would need someone willing to carry them forward until the categories caught up. The bracelet was warm on my wrist. I was already asleep before the light fully faded. 3 weeks later, Wah, the Dravathi sensor specialist, came to me in the maintenance corridor where I was running a routine coupling inspection. Wah communicated primarily through color shift and the pattern of their bioluminescent markings, which the ship's translation system was approximately 60% accurate on, which was better than nothing, and which had been getting better the longer I worked with them. Today their markings were doing something I had not seen before, a slow, steady pulse in the frequencies I had learned to associate with something they wanted to say that they were uncertain how to say. I set down my coupling reader. What's going on? A slow pulse. 2 colors I did not have a name for yet cycling through their markings. The translator rendered it haltingly as, I have an object, my parent, who died, the year I joined this ship. I looked at Wah. I carry it, they said, in my equipment kit. I was told it was not relevant to disclose. It doesn't need to be disclosed, I said. Under 7441H, you just need to have it on your person manifest if it's a conductive material or a material that could interact with ship systems. Wah pulsed, the translator gave me. It is organic material, a piece of shell from the colony where I was born. My parent held it on the day the translator stalled. Wah's markings moved through a color I had no read on yet. The day they returned to the dark. Is it non-conductive? Yes. Then you don't even need to file it, I said, but you can, if you want it on record. Another long pulse, something moving through the markings that the translator did not try to render and that I read, without the system, as the thing you feel when you have been carrying something alone for a long time and have just discovered you did not need to. It is different for us than for humans, Wah said. We do not maintain presence. We do not, a pulse, searching, continue the relationship, but the object is from the colony, from the water, When I hold it, I remember that I come from somewhere, that there was a place before this ship. A pause. Is that the same? I thought about it. About fish charms and crossed hands and things that reminded you where you came from, and that someone had believed you would keep going. Close enough, I said. Close enough that I think it counts. Wa pulsed once, slow and even. The translator did not render it. I did not need it to. A month after that, Irath stopped me in the corridor outside the medical bay and said, very carefully, in the particular Vithrani register that was formal without being stiff, I have been researching the human practice of continued relational presence. I have written a preliminary report for the Consortium Medical Archive. I would like your review before I submit, as the originating instance. I took the report. I read it over 2 days. It was thorough, precise, and contained in the concluding section, a sentence that I read until I had it by heart. It read, "The human resistance to ending relationships at biological death should not be categorized as an inability to process loss. It is more accurately described as a refusal to accept that connection is bounded by the duration of a single physical form. Whether this is philosophically correct is outside the scope of this report. What is demonstrably correct is that it functions. Humans who carry their dead forward are not impaired by the carrying. They are, in quantifiable ways, steadied by it." Steadied by it. I sent Irath one word back, submit. They submitted. It was the second human origin document in Consortium Medical Archives. The first had been a general overview of human pain tolerance that a consortium physician had filed 40 years ago, mostly to warn other consortium medics that the readings they were getting were not errors, and that humans were, physiologically, built to function through a level of physical distress that the consortium's triage systems classified as requiring immediate intervention. We had always been stubbornly functional in ways that looked, from the outside, like something that should not work. I thought Irath had captured it right. We were not carrying the dead in spite of the loss. We were carrying them because the carrying was how we managed to go somewhere as far as 6 light months from home and still know, in some deep, unargued way, that we were not alone. That there was someone still paying attention. On the night I finished reading the report, I took out the bracelet and held it in my palm for a while without putting it on. Just held it. The copper cool at first, then warming, the 3 charms nested against each other, the fish, the cross, the joined hands. I thought about all the mornings, the automatic reach for the clasp, the click of it settling on my wrist, the small, immediate rightness of it, the way a tool feels right in the hand it was calibrated for. Choice renewed daily. I put it on. The clasp clicked. The ship hummed. The stars outside the porthole ran on in every direction, enormous and unhurried, and I was a human woman 6 light months from Batangas with a copper bracelet and a file number in the Consortium Legal Archive, and a grandmother who had pressed something into my hand once and trusted me to understand what it was for. I understood. I had always understood. I just had not had the words for it in any language the consortium recognized. Now it was on record. Now it had a name. Now, somewhere in the archive of a governing body that had been running for 400 years without needing this category, there was a document that said, "This is what humans carry, and why, and what it does for them, and it is not irrational. It is unmapped, and we are learning the map." I touched the fish charm. "For your travels, Lola Sita." I am still traveling. I will keep coming back. That's a pattern I have.